Thank you very much, Suleiman. And a very good afternoon to all of you. Thanks a lot for your hospitality. That's the first thing I need to say before we talk about the topic of surveillance and monitoring. I'm happy to share a few slides with you. That's just for my own support, but I'm happy to, actually more looking forward to talk to you and to discuss this topic. Super important, I'll just take off this. As you see, looks like a surveillance environment already. There's a lot of equipment there. But let me just get it going. I mean, representing the organizations Entrima and Market Abuse Center, what we do is provide learning services. But I'll skip those slides. And if you look fast, you may spot a few things. But here we go. Why are we here? I think to discuss the topic of market surveillance, trade surveillance, market monitoring, you can say. Just the basic questions first. Why, what, where, how, and when? And if we talk about that, I think the first thing to talk about is what does market monitoring and trade surveillance actually mean? And why is there market monitoring as well as trade surveillance? Is that the same? Or are there differentials? And I think there's a lot of confusion in the markets, and there may not be one answer to that. The way I look at it is actually as follows, that monitoring for me is a general term, whereas surveillance is more indicated, it's more targeted, so you can say. And another way to express it, you can say maybe the authorities are monitoring, and whereas, let's say, trading venues like EPIAS, market participants themselves maybe even, under some regulations on the globe, are actually performing, so to say, trade surveillance. It's more in-depth, you can say, in some respects, or it may focus on individuals or individual cases. In the end, because I'll tell you something about how that's been organized in some other countries on this globe, and in many cases it's the authorities that collect information about companies. But within that company, it could be multiple players who've done particular things. And maybe something looks suspicious, but turns out not to be. If the regulator collects information about the company, from, let's say, trader 1 and trader 2 and trader number 3, altogether it may look suspicious, but in the end there may be nothing at hand. Now, yeah, so that's just a little bit to look at. Now, why do we have this all in place? Why are there regulations to prohibit market abuse? I think amongst others to protect, in the energy markets, the end consumers, in the financial markets, to protect the investors. And for instance, in the European Union regulation remit, it's been stated it's important to ensure that consumers, and by the way, also other market participants, so at least to protect the consumer, that they can have confidence in the integrity and the integrity of the electricity and gas markets, and that prices set reflect a fair and competitive interplay between supply and demand. So it's truly about true supply and true demand, and not market abuse. Oh yeah, by the way, in yellow you already see that for me, I think, and not just for me, market monitoring, trade surveillance, is not just to detect market abuse. You can actually say it's mainly, or initially, it's to prevent it. If nothing happens, you can expect some, maybe, people to behave in a certain manner, but when you do monitor, or when you do survey, I think behavior just changes. Now, I'm a former trader, and I started in the 90s, because I'm an old man, but at the time, you know, there was no regulation in the field of market abuse. And the moment it was introduced, we started to behave differently. I think that's maybe reflecting the human nature. I dare to say I wasn't an exception. Okay, where is this all about? It is what is prohibited, of course, insider trading as well as market manipulation. And throughout the globe, there's many regulations. You've got your own things in Turkey. In the European Union, for instance, there's the remit regulation, but also the market abuse regulation. In the United States, there's 3 packages of relevance for the commodity markets. In Singapore, there's another one, and so forth. Yeah? This is just a glimpse. Now, if we focus on the European Union, then there's those two packages that I just mentioned, market abuse regulation, but also remit. At the bottom, you see remit. That's an energy market specific regulation. It's focused on electricity and gas. The market abuse regulation comes from the financial markets. But in the European Union, and that differs from the situation in Turkey, I'd say, is there's European Union is a bundle of countries. So there's different countries. That means each country has its own specific energy market regulator and its own specific financial market regulator. Now, they do work together, however. But there's also a body at EU level, and you may see that there in blue, dark blue, ACER. ACER is the body at European Union level. You've got ESMA on the financial market side, that's also at the European level. So there's collaboration between ESMA and ACER, there's collaboration between ESMA and the national authorities, there's collaboration between ACER and the national authorities, and there's collaboration between national authorities, cross-border or cross-financial and energy markets. Why do they collaborate? Because, or actually for many reasons. No one oversees everything, and there are different approaches. When we talk about market monitoring or trade surveillance, there is no solution that fits all, so to say. There is no size fits all solution. It is dependent on the variety of factors. So that is maybe good to just be addressed. You can discuss about this, how to organize things. What is most effective? Cool. Now, basically, and that's where I want to go, those regulations, in this case, the remit and the market abuse regulations, they prohibit insider trade market manipulation, but apart from the prohibitions, there's obligations. Amongst that is, as you see, bullet point number 3 at the bottom, surveillance obligation. To whom does this apply? To a multitude of parties. I'll get back to that. That's, I think, the next slide or so. But there's also the publication of inside information that's crucially important. Now, let me just check, because then I'm talking about the same slide as you see. First, inside information. It has to be published. You're not surprised. You got a simulation that you can recognize here yourself. Inside information has to be published. But under the market abuse regulation, that's typically financial information. Under the remit regulation, it's mainly about physical capacities, power generation capacity, gas storage capacity, those kinds of things, transport capacity. And if it's unavailable, it's of relevance to market participants. If you want to create a level playing field, you just need to disseminate that information. You need to make it available to all the market participants. Now, I'll get back to that because that's crucially important. There's also the obligation to report data. So that is not the publication of data, ladies and gents. This is the reporting of data to the authority. In case of remit, to ACER, the European body. So basically, you see there that one circle, ARIS, ACER's reporting and information system. That has been collecting the data. What kind of data? I'll get back to the previous slide. Namely, transactional data and fundamental data. Transactional data are the transactions concluded and the orders placed and maybe cancelled or still pending, and so forth and so forth. The next one is a fundamental data. That's really about the unavailability of physical capacity. Those two things need to be compared. When, for instance, goes a power plant down, and when does that company or market participant transact electricity? If they buy electricity because the plant is down, first, of course, you need to be publishing that information, then act on that basis, not the other way around. So the regulator is comparing those two data to each other. Nevertheless, it could be that they see transaction took place first and then it was published. But it does not, it looks suspicious, but it may turn out to be okay if the transaction was performed without having access to that information. If there's a Chinese wall and separation of information flows, that can simply happen, yeah? So, but that it looks suspicious, then the market participant needs to explain themselves. So there's debate, there's discussions all the time. Okay, now that's a little bit in the introduction. Now to come closer to market monitoring trade surveillance. Now spotted the fly here. I hope it's not surveying me, yeah? You never know, but anyway. Let's see. So there's those two regulations in the European Union. remit and MAR. And there's different, both have the obligation that monitoring needs to take place and surveillance. But it applies to different kinds of parties. Under remit, it's called a PPAT. So it's a person professionally arranging transactions. Ladies and gents, in brief, those are exchanges, thinking of API's. There's also brokers and TSOs, transmission system operators, that fall into that definition. But apart from that, the market abuse regulation, that scope is a bit wider because the definition is different. It is including parties executing transactions. You see that? Those are market participants themselves, trading parties, parties with a trading function. Utilities, oil and gas companies or whatever, but also trading houses, those who transact in the market. They need to survey their own trading activity. They need to survey their own employees. In both cases, whether it's remit or MAR, in case something suspicious is taking place, it has to be reported. And then the following takes place. So a report has to be sent to the authorities. It is not allowed by those parties, even when it's the trading company, if they detect their own staff member to have done something that remains suspicious after an investigation, the company has to submit a report to the authorities, but is not allowed to inform their own traders. Because one may destroy evidence. To prevent that, it's very important not to be informed. Okay, so that's a little bit of information just to get it going. So for me, what's super important to say, I think surveillance, in other words, takes place at different levels. Actually, that's what I've just been showing you here. It's not just the authorities, but it's also the exchanges, the brokers, the TSOs. You can even say the trading organizations that could potentially be included in that scope of that regulation. But for me, also important is individuals also have to take a responsibility. Earlier today, I was in one of the rooms here, and someone said, you know, when it comes down to a zero carbon environment or society, then we all have to take responsibility, not wait for institutions or regulate or policymakers to set targets. We need to do something ourselves. Same applies here. You need to check and verify yourself in the end. Maybe it's best to do that. Better to detect yourself something than someone else to detect it. This is showing you that is not just authorities to sanction. So sanctioning in case of non-compliance can take place. This is a notice of an exchange who has sanctioned a market participant. So sanctioning can come from the authorities, but alternatively, it's the exchanges that do so. After all, it's their platform, it's their market. They operate that market. Now, all in all together, I'd like to say that yes, there has to be surveillance taking place. There has to be monitoring. If you want to do that effectively, and the same applies actually for a compliance regime, you need to have people in place. You need to make arrangements or develop procedures, and you need systems. So it's not just to have an algorithm. It's not just to have, let's say, a software package running that processes data. It's super important. Especially the more transactions take place, the more important that becomes. But it's also people that need to be checking manually. And you need people to interpret the outcomes of those systems. If those systems produce an alert or some flagging is taking place, someone has to check it. Someone has to interpret the outcome. It may look suspicious, but is it really off the hook? That question can only be answered after an investigation. And investigation requires interpretation. Interpretation requires knowledge and experience. And that also means it turns out to be subjective. Of course, that is maybe not preferred. You rather maybe have objective standards. But that's why, amongst others, for instance, in the European Union, those authorities, I'm talking about ACER and ESMA, do not just supervise markets, they also develop, and that's what you see with these blue lines, they develop guidelines documentation to explain what they believe is said by the regulation. So there's the regulation. You can also have explanatory documentation next to it. How to handle things, how to interpret things. Then the next, let's see. Oh no, I'm going too fast now. Yeah, that's why that's also been mentioned, you know, trading is super important. So if you want to have a proper surveillance and monitoring in place, then another point of quite relevance, at least some believe it's very helpful to have a whistleblowing function, a whistleblowing policy, so that whistleblowers can come forward and share their, let's say, worries or what they think they've signaled in the market. It's not a necessity, but a lot of people say, you know, it's quite helpful to have a whistleblowing possibility. That requires a policy, and when you have that, it must also be assured that those whistleblowers are being protected. And that's why you may want to have a non-retaliation policy next to it. Culture is the third bullet point on this slide. Culture sets direction. And typically it's been said that if you want to change things, you may be willing to change culture. If you want to change culture, it requires the attention of the highest management bodies or maybe a political support or and so forth and so forth. So those are a few things that I just want to share. No one is going to sit on any chair, but we've got all our own responsibility. It's just a few thoughts that are out there in the market. Maybe I can say one more thing about, and I think there's a slide about it, but anyway, whistleblowing functions. In the United States, the CFTC, one of the authorities there, they have a whistleblowing policy. Whistleblowers, if we talk about sanctioning, a whistleblower can make up to, as a maximum, 30% of the fines. So suppose there's a fine of 10 million, the whistleblower might be paid 3 million. Anyway, I don't know whether you think this is a good idea. Some people believe it is, some people are objecting against this. I believe I've seen a lot of movies, Western movies, I think they call it the bounty hunter or so, but anyway. Yeah, it's also bringing another type of culture. I don't know whether that is desirable or not, but anyway. When we are talking about trade surveillance, I just told you it's about humans, it's about procedures, but it's also about systems, so software that can actually process data. So there's a lot, the more data you have, I think the more capable you are to process data and to draw reasonable conclusions. Now, in many cases, I mean, there may be, REMIT is already effective as of 2011. The market abuse regulation is effective since years. The regulation in the United States are effective since years. But how effective is the surveillance? Well, it can always be improved, ladies and gents. It can always be improved. And in many cases, throughout Europe as an example, parties, whether it be the authorities or market participants themselves or whomsoever, exchanges, are overseeing only a part of the entire business. So it might be that someone is collecting data about electricity and gas, but the traders also do transactions in oil, or they may not do it, but others do it. And those markets are related somehow. And next to that, it could be, if you're in exchange, you're lacking data of the over-the-counter markets. Yeah, that is not a complaint. That is just what it is. But you oversee only a part. I think that's the same for parents. If your children go out, you don't oversee what they're doing. In the end, it comes down to that. Now, having said that, so a lot of people, a lot of parties work with surveillance software. That is on the side of the regulators, so the authorities. It's also on the side of exchanges, also on the side of market participants. Some market participants are not in scope of the market abuse regulation, but in scope of the REMIT regulation, and thus don't have a trade surveillance obligation, but still do monitor, because they feel that they are acting in a market, and they feel we better be safe than sorry. And why don't we take more responsibility than we need? Yeah, in the end, we work in a market, and we want to have that market to be safe and sound. And the better it functions, that's contributing to us as well. So it's a long-term objective, you can say. That software, by the way, it would be quite helpful if it also has a playback function. So you can play back. Suppose you detect something tomorrow, what happened today, and you do an investigation, and the investigation takes you 2 weeks. Then actually you wonder, gee, what was the market at the time? Can we play back that market situation? What was the order book like? What kind of orders were there to buy or to sell? And if you can play that back, and you can pull data, and you can consider what were the weather circumstances, or what was the situation in the world, and so forth, you can collect evidence or build your case and maybe draw a conclusion, not a problem at all. Or maybe draw a conclusion, well, it remains suspicious. So I think these are all things of relevance to be considered. Not per se a necessity always, but sometimes quite helpful. Another point I want to make is when we talk about market abuse, clearly there's two completely different things. It is insider trading, there's market manipulation, and when you zoom in market manipulation, there's multiple types of schemes. And I'll address a few in a few minutes, but completely different. So that is part of market abuse. But market abuse, I'd say, is part of a bigger whole, which we can call financial crime. And that includes, so there's market abuse on one side, but there's, you can say, money laundering, there's terrorist financing, there's tax fraud. All of those are financial crimes. And that means, if we talk about sanctioning, it cannot just be administrative sanctions, but also criminal sanctions. People can be sentenced. They can be imprisoned. At least that in many jurisdictions that is the case. Now, and by the way, these days there's a lot of attention for misconduct in general. So when we zoom in on manipulation, there's multiple schemes. Here I just mentioned a few, but that list is seemingly unlimited. And I'll get back to a few of those. First, a few things about sanctioning. Maybe it's not the most preferred topic, but it's an important topic. And when you have rules and there's no sanctions, I think it will be hard to have people to follow rules, organizations to comply with, and so forth and so forth. Now, often it's been said that there's administrative and criminal sanctions, but let's not forget about reputational risk. If a company is mentioned in the media and someone in the organization or the company is accused of, and maybe even found guilty of market abuse, the consequences can be really severe. The company may be sanctioned for, let's say, 10 million euros, but the consequences of the reputation being harmed could be a multitude. And there's also, and when I, for instance, look at Europe, a lot of utilities are state-owned still today. Especially those, or they even more than others, want to protect the reputation of the firm. It can't be that a state-owned company, that's what they think, believe, are convinced of, that it can't be that a state-owned company is actually involved in a manipulative scheme or insider trading. Now, let me be a bit more precise. Here is listed, I've just collected rather randomly just a few cases that we've seen over the years. A few in the United States, a few in the European Union. The one on top and the one at the bottom in the United States, Barclays has been fined for cross-market manipulation. That's in the electricity market, the spot market versus the forward market. There we go already, spot and forward. You manipulate one market in order to profit from this in the other market. It's not allowed. Cross-market manipulation, sanction almost 500 million. If you look at the bottom, JP Morgan was fined for almost 1 billion, and that was actually last year. That was in the metal markets. So sanctions can be super, super significant. In the European Union, Iberdrola, Uniper and BP. I'd like to say a few things about Iberdrola, but I'll get back to that in a few slides. In depth, basically, that was about economic withholding of physical capacity. So I'll explain that in a minute. But Uniper was the first case in Europe under the remit regulation where individuals, and by the way also the last so far, where individuals were sanctioned. Not just the company, but also to individuals. Sanctions were low, 1,500 and 2,500 euros per person. It's a lot of money when you go out for shopping, but as a sanction, it's really limited. I think the regulator just wanted to have this in place because there's, apart from the sanction and those two people involved, it's a warning to the rest of the market participants. So there's a signal being sent from it. The company was also sanctioned for a rather limited amount of money, but maybe that is also helping the authority to somehow not be appealed by that party that has been sanctioned. If the sanction is relatively low, companies typically want to accept and don't want to appeal against it, even though they've got the feeling maybe we've got the chance. But anyway, if you want to learn more about sanctioning under the European regulation remit, you can go to the website of ACER, find this list, and also on the next page. A few of the companies I just mentioned are on this list. This list is complete. If you want to learn more, there's a link. You can click on those links and you can learn about those cases. What I want to say is on top, on the right-hand side, they mention fine. So the financial penalty. I don't completely agree, because in many of those cases it wasn't a fine, but, as they call it, a settlement or a plea bargain. And that means the company is not formally accused, neither has admitted their wrongdoing, but yeah, they've put a number on it, and typically then you get a discount as a market participant. I don't know else how to phrase it, but parties agree with each other to do this. And I think it's just, maybe it's just good to know that how that system could work, or maybe sometimes doesn't work, but that's for me indifferential. I'm quite surprised that ACER calls it a fine in all those cases, whereas sometimes I believe it's not a fine. So, zooming in on a few of those cases, Intergen was fined for 37 million British pounds. And that, by the way, those sanctions are not by ACER. It's always by a national authority in the European Union, because ACER doesn't have those powers. It is the national authority to sanction. They have more, at least they should be more aware about the local situation and thus to interpret those cases. Why do I mention this case? Well, for a variety of reasons, but amongst others, this fine is not just for market manipulation, misleading notifications, so the dissemination of false/misleading information. No, it's also because of weaknesses in procedures, management systems, and internal controls. So if you have the responsibility to do something about your own organization, or to, maybe even to survey, you can also do that in a poor manner, and then there can be a sanction. I'm talking about the European Union. Although, by the way, there's Brexit now, but this is before Brexit. Yeah. Still, the British are pretty much to the same situation. Interactive brokers, also by the UK authorities, have been fined also for failings in systems and controls. So pretty much the same. They have not been abusing the market, but their setup internally was weak. Now, in case of sanctioning, I believe sanctions have to be proportionate, they must be effective and dissuasive. Those are typically three criteria that are quite relevant. So the more severe the consequences of market manipulation or insider trading, the higher the fine you can expect to be. Now I'll skip a few of those slides because that's all about sanctioning, but I'm just doing that because of time. What I want to do is actually talk to you about a few specific cases. But before I do that, maybe this is something to be brought to the attention. When we talk about surveillance, trade surveillance, we're talking about trading, and trading takes place in markets. When we talk about markets, market monitoring, I believe markets are complex social systems. And why, for me, is that relevant to have said? Because complexity, first of all, it fascinates me. It might be annoying sometimes, but what are the characteristics of a complex social system like the markets? Well, first of all, that no one knows all. No one knows all. Secondly of all, outcomes are impossible to be predicted. Well, yeah, you can predict them, but in many cases you're wrong. you need to solve the issue in a multidisciplinary manner. If you want to understand the energy markets, you need to know about physicality. You need to know the value chain, the supply chain, production, consumption, and everything that happens in between, like storage and transport. But you also need to know about economics, finance. You need to know about legal aspects, like regulations. So basically, markets are complex. There's a list of characteristics of those situations. And for me, that means if you want to perform trade surveillance, market monitoring, you need to know a lot. And luckily, you're all professionals and experts, but it doesn't apply throughout the globe to everyone active there. And in the end, no one, not even you, know everything. And therefore, I think there's an ongoing drive to keep on extending the knowledge and getting more competences and skills in place. It's unavoidable. The world is getting more complex. Luckily, you are still capable of catching up. I've almost lost it, but many people can't cope with it. And that's, I think, just reality. It doesn't apply just to markets, but complexity in general. So when we talk about trade surveillance, market monitoring, I think, as I just told you, I mean, there is no such a thing as one size fits all. So it's really specific what a company or organization or institution should do. For instance, are we talking about monitoring over-the-counter markets or bilateral trading? Because that requires different things than when it concerns exchange trading. Or when you want to talk about, for instance, power markets or electricity markets, or gas markets versus, let's say, equity markets, you require a different approach. I'm convinced of that. Now, those are a few things to mention. Spot markets, forward markets. That's all quite relevant. I'm skipping those because I want to talk to you about those 4 cases. I'm just checking time a little bit. I think we're good. There we go. I want to actually get your attention about 4 specific forms of market manipulation. I have not chosen those randomly, but for a reason. So I want to talk to you about spoofing, or sometimes it's also, layering is pretty much the same, looks pretty much the same. Wash trade, withholding capacity, and the dissemination of false misleading information. Now, why do I want to focus on those 4? Because for me, those 4 are completely different. To start with, and this overview comes from the ACER guidance, first of all, there's a few, as you see on the left, on-market types or categories of manipulation, but there's also some activity that you can do off-market. So I'm not a trader anymore, I'm not in those markets, but I'm relating to those. So even I can disseminate false or misleading information. I think that happens a lot in the crypto markets these days. But disseminating information that is false or misleading. You don't need to have market access for that. But if you want to commit spoofing, a wash trade, or withholding, you need to have market access, that's for sure. So those first 3 are on market, the other one is off market. But when we compare, for instance, number 1 with number 2, there's also a differential because spoofing for me is order driven. You need to place orders for those and cancel orders. Orders that are not executed. With a wash trade, if you also want to perform surveillance, you need to focus on the transactions performed. Orders are irrelevant. So different types of schemes, different kind of characteristics require a different scope of attention. Now, withholding of physical capacity, so for instance, you do have transport capacity, but you don't use it or you withhold it from other market participants. I'm talking about the liberalized market in any sense. That can be seen as a form of manipulation. Withholding power generation capacity, so not to offer your electricity that you can produce at a reasonable cost level, can be seen as withholding. So let's zoom in on a few of those. I'll start with spoofing. 2 people, no, many people have been sanctioned for spoofing the market. Those are just 2. Mr. Koski and Mr. Serrao, both in the United States. One has been sanctioned, the other one is not sanctioned. Why not? Because this person started to help the authority to detect more spoofers. That's a trade-off, you can say. Yeah? By the way, he recently was still sentenced, but then 1 year under the authority of his father, so he was sentenced at home. Yeah, it's another way to do it. But anyway, what is spoofing, ladies and gents? Basically, you can say it's a form of bluffing or to simulate the ghost trend. But basically, it comes down to this. Suppose this is the market at a certain point in time. I'm talking about the order book, let's say, of an exchange. There's a bid and ask. That means someone is willing to buy at 41.30 or lower, and another party wants to sell 70 units at the price of 41.70 or better. Now suppose there's a third party that steps into the market, and suppose this party has the intent, the true intent, to purchase. Then he can lift the offer at 41.70, but maybe this person has bad intentions and say, I'd rather buy cheaper and I want to help that market somehow. I want to manipulate that market. I want to spoof the market. How can I do that? This person is talking to him or herself. And this person might, for instance, although this person wants to buy, may place an order to sell without the intention to have the order executed. So maybe this party places the order in red at 41.60, let's say for sizable volume. This may attract other market participants to outperform that offer. For instance, at 41.50 in green. So people are just responding to each other. If that is the case, then that party that has that true intent and placed the order at 41.60 can step in now. And this person might lift the offer at 41.50. And typically thereafter, or slightly before, cancelling the red order at 41.60. That is spoofing. It's not allowed. Authorities in the European Union, authorities in the United Kingdom, authorities in the United States, the biggest attention goes to spoofing. Why? Because they believe it happens so often. I'm with them. In that belief, I mean. And because they believe that it can be detected relatively easy. It happens a lot. When I talk to traders in those jurisdictions I just mentioned, often they don't know that this is illegal. They do this daily, still. Then the next. So if you want to detect it, when you perform trade surveillance, focus on orders and orders placed on one side of the order book, in this case on the sell side, and transacting on the other side of the order book, namely to purchase. I have not said it is illegal to place an order on the sell side if you want to buy, as long as you also want to sell. That's a crucial difference there. Yeah? Okay. So it may have looked suspicious what I said, but hopefully it's not. A wash trade is a transaction in which there's no change in beneficial interest or market risk. Now I'll be very straightforward. An example of that, a company, two traders in one company to transact with each other, with or without their knowledge. Maybe both make use of a broker and the broker comes together and it turns out that they have been transacting with themselves. It is not, spoofing is always illegal. A wash trade is not always illegal. It depends. Two criteria of relevance. Namely, was it intended or not intended? And secondly, has the market really moved? Was it an off-market transaction? Was the price off-market? And when it's intended to be manipulative and the price changed significantly, then I guess the one on the left on top, it is a form of market manipulation. But if there was no intent and it was not off-market, why do we bother? Yeah, that is more or less the conclusion here. Now, having said that, why would someone be willing to set up a wash trade? Well, to change the market price. So, and that must be prevented, of course. The price should be set, remember, on the basis of a fair and competitive interplay between supply and demand. It's fine if you want to buy or have to buy, you can place an order to buy. If you want to sell or need to sell and you place an order to sell, that's fine. And if as a consequence of the order execution the market goes up or down, that is fine. That we call that market working. But it's not fine to do it the other way around. To place an order with the intent to move the market up or down. That is not allowed. So the devil is in the detail. It's crucially important to see the differentials there. Withholding, the third case, as I promised you. It can be physical withholding capacity or economic withholding. Let's start with physical withholding. I think you're all familiar to the Enron scandal or / situation or what happened to them. Bankrupt in 2000, what was it, 2, 3 or so. But the California energy crisis actually started to appear because Enron found reasons, or the traders instructed their dispatchers, shut down power plants, create a deficit, create a shortage, create scarcity, thereby the price will go up. Why do we want the price to go up? Because we already bought electricity contracts from others. So we control that market. And by physically withholding, so not offering that capacity that is available, you create scarcity, you drive up the price. I think this is not to the benefit of the end consumer. I don't think so, that's clear. And the consequences were there. Now, we've seen a case in Europe in 2015, and that was by Iberdrola. And they were not accused of physically withholding, but economically withholding. That means you do offer, so you don't withhold it, you do offer your electricity, but at price levels that can be qualified as excessive. Thereby, you don't create physical scarcity, but the prices do go up as well. So effectively, it is coming down to the same result. Iberdrola was found guilty. I'm super interested to see the outcome because, ladies and gents, this is in 2015. That fine is 25 million, namely 3.5 million pure fine and 21.5 million money they were said to have made by this manipulation. So first you need to hand in what you've made, and on top of that, a fine. If you lose money, you don't get a refund, eh? No, it doesn't work like that. But anyway. They were appealing against this in 2015. So they didn't like it much and they opposed. So they appealed it. It's still under appeal. So if you are truly believing, as Iberdrola, that you've done nothing wrong, still you may have bad nights of sleep. So that could be the case. Now, the last scheme I was to address is the dissemination of false misleading information. I think it doesn't need much explanation. It is not legal, it's illegal. It can also be combined. If you do have a position in the market and then you do disseminate false and misleading information, trying to move the price in your favor, there's particular schemes like pump and dump or trash and cash that actually reflect that. It's a combination of the dissemination of false and misleading information, which is already illegal, but the combination makes it even worse. And then of course the topic of algorithmic trading, what gets a lot of attention. With algorithmic trading, there's even more specific types of manipulation that have found or have come to the surface, so to say. Amongst those are quote stuffing and momentum ignition. That requires, again, a different approach and interpretation. Basically, and that's a way for me to wrap up somehow to get to an end, is I have addressed, so there at the end, 4 different cases of market manipulation. Spoofing, withholding, dissemination of false misleading information, and wash trades. If you want to detect one of those, again, you need people, you need systems, blah, blah, blah. It's quite helpful if you work with systems, so trade surveillance software, which typically are rule-based, are instructed and work on the basis of algos as well, and process data. You need to instruct those machines. You need to instruct that equipment, and that can typically be based on indicators. And a few are listed here. It is, of course, those are just indicators. So it doesn't mean if you do so, if there's a market participant who does quite a bit in the market share is high, it is not illegal. That as such is not illegal. But if you combine it with a few more flags, a few more boxes to be ticked, it could lead to conclude it is at least suspicious and there is reason to investigate. Now, If you do things close or to or in a settlement time window, that's of course also something to be taken into account, and so forth and so forth. That list is very long, you can say unlimited, and that's another point. In that yellow box, however, that's stated something else. If a party typically does particular activity, for instance, always trading in the electricity markets and always in the spot markets, and now a certain volume, and now either does something in the forward markets or either does a large volume, much larger volume, that in itself is not illegal, but there could be flagging taking place because someone is trading out of their typical profile. So it's a way just to follow what's happening and to raise questions, I guess. There's many more slides, but we need to find an end, I think, to this presentation. I thank you kindly for your attention, and I wish you a pleasant remainder, so to think. Thanks a lot. Cheers.